was once a certain type of artist in America. The artists that traveled the land collecting stories to be retold throughout. Artists like Bob Dylan, Arlo Guthrie, or Pete Seeger. But these weren't just any stories. These were stories that transcended one author. These were stories crafted by a community. These were folk stories. And over the course of several years, one man took it upon himself to uncover the folk stories of a mystical place called the Upper Peninsula.
On the birds and the bees and the cigarette trees, the lemonade springs where the bluebird sings in the bleak rock candy mountains.
Bloodstoppers and Bearwalkers by Richard Dorson was originally released in 1956 after he traveled the length of the UP. The novel's third edition was released in 2008, with additional tales selected by editor James Leary. Using stories and legends from an array of real people, Dorson's collection unveils an intimate look into a community far more diverse than ever thought before. Dorson writes with a style that blends seamlessly in with his subjects, as his pages cover both his journey, the people he meets, and the stories he uncovers. Despite being a professor at UW-Madison at the time, Dorson writes as though he's sitting down at the bar next to you. This book is thus equal parts engaging and easy to read, as wave after wave of stories wash over you. The stories themselves are actually very illuminating, far more than someone would think the 50s version of Slender Man stories would be. That's because folk stories are made by the community they spring from, burying a nugget of truth underneath a layer of backwoods humor. For instance, in one section, he covers the storied lumberjacks of the UP, simultaneously mythologized with stories of their great skill, and humanized with first-person tales of dangers behind many mid-century logging camps. Dorson writes, John Nelligan, a pioneer lumberman around Menominee, tells about the logging crew that ran short of grub in the middle of winter. They selected some of their number and entrusted them with cash to buy supplies for the balance of winter at the nearest town. Eventually, the committee returned and presented the starving jacks with several cases of whiskey and a couple of loaves of bread. After staring silently at this exhibit, one jack dourly remarked, "What the hell are we supposed to do with all this bread?" If anything negative can be said about this book, it's a result of the product of the time period. Dorson doesn't skip over the native people, and there might be some who take offense to the phrases and language from both others and Dorson himself. The author does use the phrase red men frequently, and while interviewing a codgy old resident from Mackinac Island, the old man actually says, "I've never seen a beautiful Indian maiden, and I've seen them all." The very chapter under which his time with the UP's various natives is even called Indians, Stuffed in Live, the Indian Tradition. Reading deeper, however, and it becomes apparent that Dorson is a little more progressive than others of his time, spurred by his focus on the stories from a community rather than stories of them. In fact, the chapter title is a reference to the romanticizing of the native people via false tales made up by tourism boards. As Dorson recounts from his attempts to discover native tales by asking various agents and professors, "At Lawrence, I asked the resident Indian agent the same question. Alas, if only I had come a generation sooner," he said, and he began to read from an old Ojibwe history. While he was reading, an enormous Indian stuck his head through the office window and wanted to know if the professor he had heard was in town would like to come to a storytelling social. In his travels, he shows his readers the live Indians, the ones that still live side by side with the various settlers and immigrants. The stories they tell unveil a culture far deeper than what historical accounts would lead the average reader to believe. In fact, Dorson makes it a point to showcase that, unlike the melancholy stories of love lost the Chamber of Commerce invents, many native stories are actually quite funny, with a real wit to them. Sometimes they even play off the white stereotypes painted on them. Dorson notes one such tale he heard near St. Ignace. Some dude hunters from lower Michigan stopped off at a reservation on their way to Canada to look at the Indians. One spoke to the chief through an interpreter and asked the nature expert what the winter would be like. "Oh yes, very cold winter. How do you know? White people have big log piles. Bloodstoppers and Bearwalkers is a wonderful throwback to the bygone era of folklore when children sat at their grandparents' feet and listened for hours on end. Granted, they didn't have Netflix, but I like to believe they'd make the right choice. The book is a must-have for anyone that wishes to call themselves a true Youper, or anyone just looking to hear some good stories. Plus, if you don't, it'll make Bob Dylan cry.
Rambling around your cities, rambling around your towns. I never see a friend I know as I go rambling around, boys. As I go rambling around.